Okay, so you're here for the first lightning talk, Dare to Share. My name is Eric Simbrat. By day, I'm a web manager over at the Georgia Institute of Technology. By night, I'm a PhD candidate at Georgia State University, where I'm conducting research on developing web applications with academic research within education. If you want to learn more about me, the best way to contact me is, of course, my Twitter at @esimbrat. For everywhere else and every other place other than Twitter, I go by Webbed, W-E-B-B-E-H, and you can go to webbed.com for more information, contact information, as well as the previous presentations I've done. So today we're going to talk about sharing web applications within higher ed research, and the best way to think about this is to go back to maybe when you first learned about the scientific method. If you think back to that, the scientific method was defined to you originally with 4 main areas. First, you start with a question, you propose a hypothesis, you actually go through the experiment and see what happens, and then you write up some results there. And that's all good and dandy, but there's one part that's missing here that may have been left off when you first learned about it. And that's, of course, replication. So replication, of course, is actually the reuse and reconfirming of those results. When we think about replication, there are 2 different ways of thinking about it. You can think about it in terms of adoption, that is taking what was done one-to-one, exactly how it was, and applying it where it is, or adaptation, taking it, maybe turning it on its side, making some adjustments, some customizations to it, and then applying it there. And so based on the definitions there, reuse may not be the best word there, maybe also diffusion. It's part of what we do as web developers. Part of the reuse that we have is giving out the code and the projects and the work that we do to our larger community. And of course, being digital artifacts, we have lots of different ways of doing it. We can share them one-to-one, we can put them on repositories, we can share the documentation on there. So that diffusion takes a lot of different forms. But that's the best way to have and share the replication data that allows folks to rebuild and continue and expand the work that we're already doing. So we work in education, and research within education commonly doesn't really ever touch replication when it comes to software. And software tends to be the most major egregious example that tends to be ignored. And so the question here is, why is that the case? Well, software development is discussed in educational research in some very weird ways. So at the top example, they define it simply as it's part of the code that we developed. And that's simply all they ever describe in the paper about how they built the web application. The second example lists the platforms that they used. So they used Microsoft Windows, Macromedia Director, and 2 different languages to build it up. The third example states that they don't need to explain these examples because expert built it. And it was the implementation step, the development step was entirely straightforward. Most of my projects are not quite straightforward, especially when it deals with that. And then finally, at the very bottom, we get a little bit closer to something that's usable, but it also still name drops systems, platforms, and tools, and doesn't talk about the actual process that we go through. If you describe for example, the WordPress project you have last built, the way you describe it is not, I use WordPress, drop mic. There's usually a lot more that goes into it than that. And so talking about how we actually go about and build software is very difficult and complex. It's not as nuanced and as simple as these examples are stating. Research usually prefers not to do it, either because the journals don't like very technical talks, or because it's very difficult to translate that conversation into something that a researcher outside of the field of web development or IT or computer science could understand. This chokes opportunities for replication and makes it very difficult to look at a project and see how you can recreate it or extend it or expand on it to do something new. But we, as a community, are a perfect use case for talking about how to go about development in software, and especially with web development. And of course, because we are using WordPress, we learn a lot of different things. It's not just learning the ins and outs of the WordPress dashboard. It's working with CSS, PHP. And of course, with all of these things that you're doing, I can ask the question, did you learn alone by yourself, or did you learn from others and the expertise of both yourself and everyone else? And the answer would probably be that a large majority of you lean more towards the bottom, where we all share and learn from one another, whether it's through code samples, documentation, articles, or even asking a question and getting an answer. Because we already do this and continue to do this to build our expertise. And a good example of this will be a topic you will hear about later in the conference, which is how to prepare for Gutenberg and the GUTENPOCOLYPSE that's coming up. So all of those things, we are not all doing this in a void. All of this is happening for all of us at around the same time. And so the knowledge that you are bringing to that project and rolling that out to your websites and to your campus installations are not being done in a vacuum. What works for one institution and a best practice that works for there may be reused and repurposed by another. You may be taking an example from another institution and repurposing that for your project. And so this is my call to arms for helping make our world a better place, especially when it comes to education. In the same way that you are currently helping out your community within web development, your academic side also needs you as well. Your expertise and knowledge in the area of content management, system design, development, and coding best practices are absolutely crucial. And I should note that there is a good session later on in the conference, I believe on Saturday, about documentation for developers. And you have to remember that documentation isn't about just how you build it or the user interface. It's also about the code at the end of the day if you want someone to reuse or repurpose that. So here's what you can do. One, you can spread the good word of WordPress and content management system design to your faculty and research. This means that you can say what content management systems are good for and what they're bad for. And so just because WordPress can fit every use case under the sun with enough custom code doesn't mean that a faculty member needs to use it if there's for example, a pre-built open source software that's better suited for that. By helping your faculty by serving as that subject matter expert, you can help guide that faculty member that may not be as nuanced in web development or in web software to help point them in the right direction. Second, this is the call to arms to share your work far and wide, and more importantly, share how you did it. What does that mean? Our favorite word, documentation. So documentation is super important, both about how you did it and why you built it, and to show both the code, the process, and the mindset. Number three, of course, is to promote and encourage multiple ways about talking about web development. It's not just the code and the process of going from staging to, from wireframes to building out a first pass at it and then sending it to the client for review. You can talk about different ways of proposing it, either from the web developer standpoint or from a designer standpoint, or from the interactions that you have between, for example, your end users and the developers when you go for review or for staging to see how things work out. All of those different perspectives are super important and have a lot of metadata attached to it. There are some areas to which we do really well, things like coding documentation, whereas when we talk about how we take feedback from end users and apply it to reiterations, sometimes it's not something we document very well. Those different avenues and thinking outside of the box on how to describe a project in multiple different ways is super helpful in expanding the knowledge in the community and providing this for everyone to reuse and reshare. And so, yes, development, philosophy, design, plugin decisions, why you use one plugin over the other. When you ask that on WPCampus's Slack, that's actually a decision that's being made within a community where you're asking for the input and finding what other folks have been doing. And then, of course, the wonderful workflow and process of how you're actually building this out. And last but not least, you could actually volunteer to be a subject matter expert for a research project. Provide your expertise, your background, and your experiences to help guide the researchers and the faculty members in the right direction. Whether that means you're writing the code or that you're serving as the middle person between, for example, faculty with their boatloads of money and their projects where they spend that boatloads of money, you can do that. However, there are lots of opportunities for you to provide your input and help be that voice of expertise to help guide their project so that it can be most useful to the community. And so, with that, I challenge you all to dare to share by daring to care. Thank you.